In this lesson, we're going to take a look at the differing armies, those opposing armies of the American states, places like Virginia or Massachusetts or New York. You have to remember, even though I use this whole idea of American states, you have to keep in mind these were essentially separate nations. They weren't really a nation yet. That really wouldn't occur, some would say, until after the war between the states in the 1860s. But we have those on one side, and then we, of course, have the British Empire on the other side. So we're going to contrast these two. We'll take a look at the British first, particularly the British officers. Now, of course, you have famous names like Howe, or famous names like Cornwallis or Clinton, all great generals in the British pay. But what you need to understand about these leaders or about these men is that they typically paid for their rank or did something politically to earn their position of power. And so in the British military, the way it was structured at the time, you didn't become an officer of higher rank because you had earned it somehow through school or because you had earned it by distinguishing yourself in battle. Those things certainly helped, but one of the primary ways you got your rank was simply by buying it. And so the men who were in charge of these things were often men who had great means, men who had great fortunes to draw from to do this. The interesting thing about the British military is it had a top-down system. Not terribly unlike that of, say, the Incas, but this top-down system was put in such a way that the commander gave the order and then it was meant to cycle down through the chain of command. And that's normal in the military. But the problem is that typically it was unilateral. Now, unilateral is a term you may not be familiar with, but unilateral means one-sided. Essentially, you have one man making the decision, and the others just obey the decision. They don't have an opportunity to register an opinion with the lead man. And because the British operated this way, and they had a top-down system, if the officers were taken out, if they fell in battle because they were wounded or killed, or went missing or taken as prisoner, if any of those things happened, the men below them often were a little bit leaderless and unable to actually continue the fight. That was one of the great weaknesses that the American states and the American militias and army were able to exploit about the British. Another interesting thing about British officers is they typically had a disdain for the American rebels, as they saw them. They did not see them as trying to right wrongs. They saw them, as I mentioned, merely as rebels. They saw them as people who had betrayed their king and country and needed to be punished. That's why men like the British General Grant was able to say, if a good bleeding can bring those Bible-faced Yankees to their senses, the fever of independency should soon abate. In other words, they saw these American revolutionaries or reformers, depending on how you view them, they saw them as people who simply had gotten riled up about something, were angry, but that eventually would disappear. Now, underneath the officers, of course, were the British regulars, known as redcoats, those soldiers in the field, the infantry, those who did most of the fighting. What you need to know about them is that, first of all, they were probably the best fighting force in the world at this time. They were rigorously trained. They were professionals. They went all around the world fighting the battles of the British Empire or the battles of the king and the Parliament. They also were incredibly well equipped. They had the supplies, the ammunition, the gunpowder, the food, the clothing, the tents, all the things that they needed. They had those usually in great supplies. Not only that, but they were often very well paid. And so it was actually attractive at certain times to become a British soldier and serve in that way because it was a steady paycheck that was decent. And so as a result, they were highly respected and had won victories throughout all the known world. After all, it would be these troops who would ultimately defeat Napoleon. Well, the Americans were much different. The Americans often had to face these men who showed them very little respect. In fact, one of the things that happened with the British regulars is, like the officers, they had little respect for the Americans they were around. And so things like stealing, pillaging people's homes or barns were common. Abusing the locals, or even things like rape, were also quite common. It was also common that when Americans surrendered to these British soldiers, that they would be bayoneted. They would not be fired upon, they'd be stabbed with the bayonet because they were seen as rebels who were going to go to the gallows anyway. What's also curious, and something that David Hackett Fischer points out, one of our great modern historians, he says this was the only war in the history of Britain, or the history of modern Britain at least, in which no medals were given, no honors were awarded. In other words, this is a war that Britain in many ways would like to forget. The American Army, though, as I mentioned to you, was rather different. At the lead of the American officers, of course, was the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, and that was George Washington, who, as I mentioned to you earlier, was an unlikely candidate for the post. He was a man who had only been a colonel, and that only of a state militia. He was a man who hadn't fought in a conflict in several years. He was a man who really had no major military experience. And it was unlikely that he actually should be chosen, but he was. And my whole argument is that he was chosen based upon the character and the determination that he had. That's what Congress saw in him. But this was a war in which he fought that lasted for 8 years, in which he spent most of his time retreating with the army to keep them intact. In fact, he would lose 6 major battles and only win about 3 of them. One of the pivotal battles, Saratoga, he wasn't even present for. But what we know about Washington is Washington, who was patient, was also a man who was very much about excellence. He was very much about things being done in a way of excellence. In fact, he had a favorite quote, a famous old Latin quote here. It goes like this: "'Tis not in mortals to command success, but will do more, will deserve it." In other words, Washington, who as far as we can tell was a firm believer, was a man who understood that not only do you pursue things with your best effort, but you need to pursue them with a character in such a way that it merits success. That was one of the incredible drives behind Washington as a man. Washington also was a great man of providence. He was a man who trusted in eternity and eternal things, and the fact that there is an eternal God who oversees every little bit of history. And so Washington, for example, would often walk the perimeters of whatever fortification he was at. He would often be seen exposing himself to enemy gunfire or up on his horse in the midst of rain just to make certain that everything was the way that it should be. He was a man who shared the hardships of his men. If they were cold, he was cold. If they were suffering without food, he would suffer without food. If they were being fired upon, he would put himself in a position also to be fired upon. Not foolishly, but in such a way that his men knew that he shared their life. He shared their hardship. It's what made him such an effective leader in the first place. But it's also incredible, there's a little tale told about Washington, that on the eve of battle, when the British were about to take over New York City, and Washington was there with a much inferior force to defend New York City, he had already inspected the lines, he had already told all of his officers what to do on the following day, and what should do if this happened or that happened. He'd done everything that he could do to prepare for the battle. And so, having nothing else to occupy his time in terms of the military, he went to his command tent and he wrote a letter to the farm manager, who actually was his brother, back at his home in Mount Vernon, telling him instructions for the coming season. In other words, household chores. It was basically a list. Now, I tell you that story to give you an idea of Washington's mind. He was a man of great calmness. He was a man of great serenity or peace. He understood that there's only so much you can do. There's only so much that you can accomplish, and the rest is in the hands of providence, in the hands of God himself. As a result of things like that, Washington was remarkably open to the advice of his officers. He did not operate unilaterally. He operated multilaterally, many-sided. He would look to his officers for advice. He would look to them for counsel, and he would often not only listen to it, but actually use that counsel in his battle strategy. As a result, the American Army had a replacement command structure, which means that if an officer fell in battle, there was another man already charged to take his place if that happened. So even though they were smaller, even though they had much less to work with, they were able to work very effectively. So one of the reasons why they ultimately won the war. He, of course, had incredible men with him. He had men like Israel Putnam, who we mentioned earlier. He was the hero of Bunker Hill, the man known simply as Old Put. There's a little story told about him. He came across a corporal in the American Army who was disdaining. He was a little upset that he had to dig a trench. And rather than simply rebuke the man and tell him to dig the trench, Putnam got down and dug the trench himself. In other words, he was a man who led by example, which is what many of the American officers did, which is what garnered them so much respect. Washington also had men like Henry Knox, who was actually a bookseller from the city of Boston. But Knox was put in charge of the artillery and actually was a brilliant artillery commander. He was also quite effective because he was stubborn. He would not back down when something needed to be accomplished. Washington also had men like Nathanael Greene, who really became his right-hand man. Nathanael Greene shared Washington's vision of wearing down the British over a long period of time. It's one of the reasons why Washington later on put Greene in command of the Southern Theater. Now, as for the army themselves, as for those soldiers who were commonly in the field, we understand a few things about them. First of all, they were typically farmers. They were typically craftsmen. They were people who came from a wide variety of backgrounds and often from a wide variety of ages. That's why you had people who were 15 years old in the Continental Army, and then, of course, you had people who were in their 60s or even their 70s who had grandchildren or sometimes even great-grandchildren who were bearing arms. It was an incredible, ragtag, diverse army. It had soldiers that came from New England that were self-sufficient, that had that old Puritan stock and mindset in them. You had aristocrats who came from places like Virginia. You had backwoods riflemen, men who wore outfits similar to, say, Daniel Boone, and were used to growing up in the wooded wilderness. You had silk-stocking gentlemen from places like Maryland. And, of course, you had Scotch-Irish that came from the southern colonies or from the middle colonies. It was an army of incredible diversity. In fact, David McCullough has this to say about the Continental Army. He says, "It was an army of men accustomed to hard work being the common lot. They were familiar with adversity and making do in a harsh climate. Resourceful, handy with tools, they could drive a yoke of oxen or hove up a stump or tie a proper knot as readily as butcher a hog or mend a pair of shoes. They knew from experience, most of them, the hardships and setbacks of life. Preparing for the worst was second nature. Rare was the man who had never seen someone die." In other words, these were men who had incredible skill sets. These were men who were much more than soldiers. These were men of great callings. These were men who had lots of skills. These were men who were husbands, who were fathers, who were brothers, who were sons, who were grandfathers. A wide variety here. This is what made the Continental Army so great and what made it so diverse. It's also this backbone of moral character that caused the American Army to practice what David Hackett Fischer calls the policy of humanity. In other words, when the British surrendered, they often did not return the bayonet. They often took them prisoners, and we have several accounts in which British prisoners were probably treated better than American prisoners. It's one of the incredible statements or testaments to the virtue and the character of this Continental Army.